Have you ever felt either too stubborn to reach out for help when you had difficulty while feeding your baby, unaware of who you could call, or mistrustful of those who were available to you when you did mention a concern? My guest, Shelly, shares her experiences navigating a landscape with very little support. She still managed to feed her babies in large part due to what she describes as an intense stubbornness. And I will add a couple of well-timed supporters who helped at just the right moments. She has taken this feeling of not knowing who she could trust, of feeling judged while feeding her babies, and of being given wrong information, and has made it her passion to provide all families with non-judgmental baby feeding and sleep support. I was one of those families that she supported, so it is my deep honor to share her baby feeding stories. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever breastfed and only seeing it up close from a couple of them, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a lactation consultant, and a childbirth educator. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore breastfeeding experiences through the lens of systemic barriers, so that you know your breastfeeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are.
My name is Shelly Taft. I am an international board certified lactation consultant and a doula and a family educator and a sleep coach and a nurse. I like to collect initials after my name, I guess you could say. And my husband and I live outside of Boston, and we are raising 7 kids together.
7 kids. That's a lot.
Yeah, I drink a lot. No, I'm totally kidding.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, so you are a professional and
Mhm,
have a lot of experience helping families feed babies.
mhm.
But we're actually here to talk about your own personal experiences, which I know you probably don't spend too much time talking about now that as a pro, you really hear other people talking about their experiences.
Mhm.
Um, so I want to first take you back to before you were feeding babies yourself, um, and ask what your exposure to baby feeding was, particularly feeding babies from your own body before it was
Mhm.
your turn and before you were making decisions about this for your family.
Yeah, so I got pregnant with my first when I was on the younger side. And I, of course, had no friends or anyone my age who had babies at that time. I was the first in my friend group and my cousin group. My mom had breastfed me and my sister very briefly, only for about 3 weeks, because then she had to go back to work, and back then they didn't really have laws to protect your right to pump at work, and they didn't really even have good breast pumps. So she did her best with breastfeeding us while she could, and then weaned us to formula, as soon as she went back to work. So growing up, I had never really seen babies fed from the body. I'd always seen babies being fed with bottles. And I had not really had any experience actually at all with infants. When my daughter was born and they immediately put her skin to skin on me, that was actually like the first time in my memory that I had actually held a baby. So as you can imagine, I was
Wow.
beyond clueless. And I remember during my pregnancy, I was getting my hair cut, and it was actually my hairdresser that brought up breastfeeding with me. Like, she was just making conversation with me, and she was just like, "Oh, are you planning on breastfeeding?" And it made me pause, and I was like, "You know what? I hadn't even thought about that."
Hmm.
And she's like, "Well, I have this book that you can read." And she lent me her copy of The Womanly Art of Breastfeeding.
Wow.
And I read it, and I was just like, "This is it. This is how I want to feed my baby. But that was the only education that I had done prior to my daughter being born, my child being born, was just reading a book. I didn't take a breastfeeding class. I didn't do anything like that. I read that book and I was very much like, I can do this. This is at least, I think in a way it was because I was feeling very insecure about my ability to be a good parent because I had so little experience, that I was like, I can do this. Also, I was a little broke having a baby, and it seemed to be the more economic choice at the time. So,
Mhm. Yeah, a lot of people think that, yeah.
yeah,
May I ask how old you were? You say you were a little young, but that means different things to different people.
this is true. Yes. So I was 20 when I got pregnant, and I was
Okay.
21 when she was born.
Okay. Which in generations past, that was totally normal, but for our
Hmm.
generation, it's on the young side, depending on what your culture is,
Correct. Yes.
cultural upbringing. Yeah.
Yes. So in
Um,
my family and friend group, it was on the younger side.
yeah. Yeah. And so interesting that that first question of how you were planning to feed your baby came not from a healthcare provider, not
Yeah.
from a friend, but from your
From a hairdresser.
hairdresser. Yeah, and it really changed the whole course of your life.
Yes, and I think back to that all the time, and, I still go to the same hairdresser. It's been, like, almost 20 years. When I started to go to her to get my hair done, she was pregnant with her first, and now he's, like, in his 20s, so
Oh my
but
goodness, so
yeah.
you were both pregnant. And so she
Yes.
was kind of asking she had read this book and she was considering how
Mhm.
she would feed her baby, and so you were talking kind of as peers, really.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but my OB did not ask me a single question about how I intended to feed my baby.
Mm,
Um, they did not do a breast exam. They did
mm,
not look at my health history for risk factor. Like, I had no guidance. They didn't suggest a breastfeeding class, no guidance, no information from my OB at the time.
mhm,
Which,
mhm.
looking back, as a new parent, I didn't think that that was odd, but looking back, especially as a professional, that's not right. It's not right that that happens.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so what was it about that book that made you think, "Yes, this is the way that I want to feed my baby?" You brought up the economic reasons, but was there
Mhm.
anything else that made you think, "Yeah, this is what is right for my family?"
Yeah, so the version of the Womanly Art of Breastfeeding that I read was an older version. So the current version is much, much different than the version I read, and I think that is a more positive thing. I think the more current version is more takes into account more diverse family structures and things like that. But the thing that really drew me to the older version of that book when I read it was it definitely encouraged you to have a sense of trust in your body and in your body's abilities and in your parenting instincts. Like, if you felt like this was the right thing, if you felt like it was right for you to hold your baby while they napped, or it was right for you to pick up your baby when they cried, or it was right for you to co-sleep with your baby, then that was the way that you should do it.
Mhm.
So I liked that better than other parenting that books that I read where there wasn't any encouragement to trust your intuition, but more of like, this is just how you should do it. And if you're not doing it this way, you're doing it wrong.
A very prescriptive approach.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Mhm.
Which so much of feeding our babies is really instinctual, but when we get told from day 1, "This is how you need to do things," it makes us distrust our gut
Yes.
feelings, and
Yes.
then that takes us down this cycle of feeling like we have to double guess ourselves all the time,
Mhm. Yeah. And I think
and
the thing that helped me was I tend to be very stubborn,
mm,
especially when I was younger. I was
mhm,
very, very stubborn when I was 20 and 21. And I remember, my mother-in-law, I had told her that I was planning on breastfeeding, and she had not attempted breastfeeding with her children. And she was so full of disbelief that I could do it. Like, she would say, "Oh, as my due date got closer and closer, she would say, "Well, I just bought some formula to keep in the house because you're probably going to want to supplement because, the baby's probably not going to get enough from you." And I feel like the more distrust she voiced in my ability to breastfeed, the more stubborn I became at making it work and actually doing it. And part of that was my insecurity. Like, I felt like that I had to prove that I could be a quote unquote good mom or
Mm.
capable mom
Mhm.
because I was young and had no experience at all. So every time someone voiced or expressed, you know, n- disbelief that I could do it, it just made me even more determined to do it.
Which happened to work out for you, but for so many other people, it can have the opposite effect.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. So that was when my stubbornness actually benefited me for once.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so man, thank the universe for this hairdresser who got you on this quest because it's not only benefited you, but so many people,
Mhm.
um, to be able to feed their babies in the way that feels good for them or to at least get some peace about the way they're feeding their babies.
Right.
Um, so you read The Womanly Art of Breastfeeding, you make this decision through some sheer will and determination. You are gonna do it. Everybody else be damned. So you mentioned this moment where they put your daughter on you, and
Mhm.
you said this was about 20 years ago?
Yeah, so I had her when I was 21 and I'm 39 now, so
Okay, okay. So I know the culture in the birthing room was a little different then. So,
Mhm.
tell us a little bit about what might have happened in the birth that either positively or negatively impacted what happened for you for feeding your babies.
Sure. So I would say I did not take a childbirth class either. I had a distant cousin recently had a baby, and a friend of mine had asked her, "Do you think Shelly should take a class?" And she had said, "No, just get the epidural. You'll be fine." So I went in thinking this is what you're supposed to do, not really considering that I had other options. Um, I was in a little bit denial when I went into labor, so I started having contractions and, my husband at the time was like, "We should go in." And I was like, "No, let's just wait. Let's watch a movie." We ended up watching all of the Batman movies that was out at the time because every time the movie would end, he'd be like, "Should we go in now?" And I was like, "No, no, no, I'm fine. We can watch another movie." And then after we watched all those, it was quite late, and so we went to bed, and when I woke up to my water breaking in the bed. It was like I know it usually doesn't happen like in the movies, but for me, it did happen like in the movies, like the huge gush of water,
Mm.
and I was like, "Oh, great. Okay, I guess I can't deny that this is happening anymore. We've gotta go in." So by the time I got in to the hospital, I was already 7 centimeters dilated and moving along quite quickly. And I was being very verbal about it. The nurses did not appreciate that. They
Mm.
told me that I was being too loud and that I was scaring the other moms on the birthing unit. And at one point, the nurse said, "I'm going to give you a little bit of hydration through your IV." But what it actually was Stadol. So they gave me a narcotic through my IV without telling me. Which I do not know if that would have happened if I was a little bit older and not so naive. So that hit me like a truck. And because I was so loopy, they were like, "Okay, now it's time for your epidural." And I was like, "Okay." I was probably fully dilated at this point. I don't even know why they gave it to me, but they did. And she was born. And because of the medications that I was given, she was extremely sleepy
Mhm.
and not that interested in eating. And
Yeah,
I
because it was
remember
given right then, right at the
yes,
time of the
yeah,
birth. So the amount of time between administration of the medication and the emergence from the birth canal matters.
Right. Yeah. And I continue to have all home births after that, by the way, because of this experience. But I do remember requesting that lactation come to my room multiple times. No one came until probably a couple hours before I was being discharged. And they walked in the room. Now, I gave birth at the same hospital that I later worked as an IBCLC for almost 10 years. So it's kind of like ironic.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember that I was in the bed. We had packed everything up. We knew we were going to be going home soon. I'm trying to get her to latch. She will not latch. She's still just like super sleepy. And this woman walks in, does not introduce herself to me. I have no idea who this woman is. And she looks at me and she says, "What are you doing?" And I said, I'm trying to feed my baby, but she won't latch. And she grabbed my breast, grabbed my baby, shoved her on, and said, "There, she's on," and started to walk out of the room. And I
Oh my
said,
gosh,
"Wait, wait,
Shelly.
wait." I said, "Wait, come back," because she's on, but it really hurts. And she flipped a nipple shield on the foot of the bed and said, "Well, you can take this home with you. If it keeps hurting, you can use this," and walked out of the room. And that was the lactation support that I got at the hospital.
Shelly, I have never been so flabbergasted throughout the course of the first 15 minutes of a podcast episode in my
Mhm.
life.
It was unreal. And again, I'm being young and not experienced at all in anything related to parenting. At the time, I did not think it was unreal. At the time, I was like, "Oh, well, this must be how it is, right?" But later in all my years of working at that hospital, that memory drove me to make sure that every time I walked
Right.
into a room, the first thing I did was introduce myself. I mean, you learn that in nursing school anyway, right? But so many people
Right.
forget. And I always ask for permission before I touch anybody. 100%.
Right. If you
Is it all
need
right if
to
I
at
touch your
all.
breast?
Right.
Yes. Yep. So we were discharged and we went for a weight check the next day at the pediatrician. And the pediatrician said, "Your baby's lost too much weight. You need to start supplementing." And I was so upset. I was so upset. I was crying the whole ride home. I got home and um, I looked up the Leche League. I knew about the Leche League because it was their book that I had read, The Women Learn to Breastfeeding is put out by the Leche League. So I Googled, at the time we were not living in Massachusetts, we were living in Connecticut. I Googled and I called this leader and she was amazing. And she's like, "Well, just tell me what's going on." And I said, "Well, she's really sleepy. She only takes one breast each side." And she's like, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. You're going to make sure she takes both breasts each feeding." And I said, "Okay." And she's like, "I will come to your house and help you latch her if you want." And I said, "Well, the latch isn't really hurting anymore. So let's just see how it goes." And in two days, she gained like something ridiculous, like 8 ounces or something like that.
Wow.
So that's all I had to do. That's all I had to do was make sure she
Jeez.
was eating off both breasts. And the pediatrician did not ask me anything about the feeding except for how many times is she feeding a day. Did not ask me, how long is she feeding? Is she taking both breasts? Does she seem satisfied? Is she awake when she's feeding? Are you seeing swallows? Nothing like that. There was no investigation. There was no attempt to see, okay, breastfeeding isn't quite working the way we want it to because your baby's losing too much weight. Let's explore that a little bit. It was like, no, you just need to give formula. And luckily I called that leader. And formula is not evil. I'm not like one of those lactation consultants. Like I'm not anti-formula. So if needed, I would have given it to her in a heartbeat. But it just kind of angers me that it wasn't really needed. But that was the only solution that I was presented with from
Right,
her
of course.
healthcare
Formula
provider.
is often necessary in situations in which a baby is not gaining and you can't figure out why. The problem lies in the fact that so many providers are not properly educated on milk supply
Mm-hmm.
and on helping parents to determine the source of the problem when babies have lost a little bit of weight or when milk transfer isn't happening. And instead of helping them get to the root of the problem, They cover it with a Band-Aid and then don't acknowledge the pain of that loss for those parents. And then those parents walk away feeling like they failed
Mhm.
instead of feeling like they were failed.
Right.
That's where
Right.
the problem lies.
The parents don't feel, the system feels them. Right.
Yeah, and there was so much that was happening for you. There were so many instances that you just talked about with your first child where it could have gone a different way for you.
Mhm.
And when we look at trying to make cultural shifts, it's fine. You know, each person gets to make the decisions for their babies. But when we know the impacts of more babies receiving human milk across the globe, the impacts that can have financially, long-term health impacts, and then the mental health impacts for both baby and for mom, big picture, we know how important it is for more people to be able to feed their babies with ease from the milk from their bodies.
Right.
And so when time after time people repeat this story that you just said, it is problematic.
Mhm.
And it's still happening. Like there, you know, it's improved, but this still happens. And, you know, the story that you told of being given a narcotic without your consent in the IV, I think that's probably pretty rare today.
Yeah.
But there are so many instances of non-consensual touch,
Oh, it was not.
non-consensual actions in the birthing room. Like that is
Yeah.
not uncommon.
They kept asking me if my mother knew I was there. They kept asking my husband if he wanted to be put on the birth certificate, if he was going to stick around. I mean, it was not a good experience. It was not an awful experience. A lot of things went well. I think the reason why it went as well as it did was because I was in denial and didn't get there until I was like almost done,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah,
Basically. If I
right,
had gone in at that first contraction, who knows? Who knows what would have happened?
right. And these things impact milk supply because of how milk supply works hormonally. And so anytime there are high levels of cortisol in a situation, that is going to impact the milk ejection reflex.
Mhm. Yeah, and how supported do you feel, right? I ended up doing a lot of lying to my kids' pediatricians over the years because
Mm,
I didn't trust because of that experience. I did not trust the things that they told me. Um, and I didn't want to deal with having that discussion with them. So in a
mm.
way, it made me very much distrust the medical community. Um, like I remember lying about co-sleeping with my baby. I remember lying about how long she ended up nursing. After that, it was a pretty smooth nursing journey. And she ended up nursing over 2 years.
Mm.
And I remember, I think she was like maybe 18 months. And they're like, the pediatrician was like, "You're not still breastfeeding, right?" And I was like, "No, who does that?" Secretly,
Mhm.
like, of course
Mhm.
I was. But I didn't want to have that discussion with them because number one, they weren't going to change my mind. And number two, like, there was no harm in not telling them, right? It's not like I was hiding that she was sick or something like that.
Many of us who have chosen to safely bed share, or to tandem feed our babies, or to feed long into toddlerhood, have had this experience choosing what to share with a provider and what to keep to ourselves. And why? For what purpose? As providers, we would better serve families if they felt they could be fully honest with us. I don't know how many times I have spoken with a peer through peer counseling or a client who is afraid to tell me they have used formula or they want to use formula or that they don't want to breastfeed any longer because they have had a bad experience with a lactation provider who has pushed them to continue breastfeeding or won't answer their questions regarding formula or just isn't fully listening to their needs. As I do fully listen, more of their needs unfold as they begin to trust me. Please as doulas, lactation professionals, or anyone who works with families in the postpartum period, or if you are just a friend, take the time to hear what people really need before you guide them. It is not your agenda that matters, but theirs.
So I got pregnant with my second, and she was born right after my daughter's second birthday, my first child's second birthday. During the pregnancy, Brooke, my first child, self-weaned, which happens as the milk reverts back to colostrum. She was clearly ready to wean on their own. I was not. So the first time they declined when I offered it, I was like, are you sure? I'm not like ready for this. And I remember at the time, breastfeeding had become like a parenting tool for me. It just solved everything, right? If they bumped their head, stick boob in the mouth, it fixed it. Everything, including temper tantrums. If Brooke ever started winding up for a temper tantrum, I would just say, hey, we called it nanas in my house. Do you want nanas? And they'd be like, yeah. So I remember the first day that they declined to nurse, and I was like, well, maybe it's just a fluke. And the next day they started to have some trouble with their, small body, big emotions. And I didn't know what to do because I'd always just solved it by sticking the boob in the mouth. So that was something that I had to learn, to rely on other tools besides the breastfeeding. But yes, my second was born at home, and she was a bigger baby. She was over 9 pounds, and she latched right away, and it hurt a lot, which surprised me because at that time I thought, I'm experienced mom now. I know what I'm doing, as we all do, right? And yeah, she chewed my nipples up like a raw hamburger. It was not fun. The other issue was I didn't necessarily have this problem so much with my first baby, but with my second and my third, I did have like massive oversupply. So very engorged, lots of plug ducts, a lot. And I just remember it was probably extremely painful for the first 3 or 4 weeks. And at the time, because I was so stubborn and because I was like, I know what I'm doing, I don't need help, I did not reach out for help at all. And I remember one night it was like 2 a.m. and I'm sitting in front of my computer nursing her, like tears streaming down my face. And I'm looking at a picture of a latch, like what a good latch looks like on, I think it was kellymom.com. And I'm looking at the picture and I'm looking down at her and I'm looking at the picture and I'm like, I don't know if this looks like a good latch or not. And eventually it became not painful and my nipples healed up, and the rest of the breastfeeding journey went fine with her. And she did not have any issues with weight gain or anything because I just had, like, she would come off coughing and choking, get sprayed in the face. Like, I just sprayed milk everywhere. I'd get over the couch, the dog, the ceiling, the floor. Everything was covered in milk. So, so after that initial rough few weeks, that got much better. And she also ended up breastfeeding for over 2 years.
Did you have somebody that you could have called, to help you? I mean, could you have called that La Leche League leader again? Or look, what do you think? You mentioned feeling like I'm experienced. Being what was keeping you from calling someone? Was there anything else getting in the way?
I would probably say a little bit like finances. Like at the time in Massachusetts, insurance companies were not reimbursing or covering for lactation services, which is different than now. Now most of them are. And we were living with my mom at the time. because we didn't have a lot of money. So I think finances played a part in it, but I think it was more my stubbornness of like, I don't need help. I don't need help. I'm sure I could have found someone to call. And that after I started to feel better and my nipples started to heal up, I thought to myself, I really don't want to go through this again, either later on with this baby or in any future babies. And that's when I finally started to actually go to the Leche League meetings. But at the time that I started to go, most of our breastfeeding issues had already resolved.
It's so interesting how whether it's mental health or the most difficult breastfeeding pain, it is so hard to reach out in those deepest, darkest moments.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I will say, I think something else that played a part was with my first baby, I did have horrible postpartum depression. I gained like 100 pounds after like it was bad. And with my second, I took all of these steps to make sure I didn't, or I could avoid postpartum depression as much as possible. So comparatively, even though physically I was in a lot more pain than I was with my first baby, I felt so much better postpartum than I did with my first baby. So in my head, I wasn't thinking, this is a really horrible time. And it was like, I've got these really torn up nipples and I'm yelling into a pillow every time I latch my baby on, but everything else is going great. It's just this one issue. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And was it painful for the entire duration of the feed or the first 20 seconds?
At first it was painful throughout the entire duration.
Mhm.
And then it started to get less painful, and then it started to get only that initial like latch on, like for 20
Mm.
seconds, and then it eventually
Mhm.
went away.
And you think she
And
just was opening up wider as she
you
got
know,
a little
I don't know. I don't
older?
know what I looking back, it was probably her cheeks, because she was a big baby and
Mhm.
she had cheeks that were so big that her
Mhm.
eyes were like almost squished. She,
Mhm.
those thick, meaty cheeks.
Mhm.
And now, as a professional looking back, I'm like, well, when they have these super massive cheeks, it can interfere with latch. It can make it harder for them to take a bottle. It can make it harder for them to take a pacifier. And she did not take a bottle. She
Mm.
was a bottle refuser. So
Mhm.
my guess is that it was her cheeks.
Yeah. Wow.
Mhm.
Yeah, so interesting. And sometimes those things resolve on their own and sometimes they don't. And you can either
Mhm.
get help and try to see if someone else can help you resolve them, or sometimes people end up feeding the baby in a different way, you
Right.
know, if it's
Right.
unbearable for too long.
Mhm.
Yeah. The reason I brought up, not being able to reach out in those deepest, darkest moments is because I often recommend to people prenatally talk to a couple of people, IBCLCs, or if you don't have the budget or your insurance won't reimburse for an IBCLC, La Leche League leaders or Breastfeeding USA leaders,
Mhm.
reach out to a couple of people prenatally and figure out who it is you vibe with in the
Yeah.
prenatal period. Because when you are in the deepest, darkest moment and it is too hard to call in that moment, you don't want to be doing that research then. You
Mhm.
want to just already know the person's name, and you just can either text or call in that moment. And if
Yeah.
there's any paperwork to fill out, you want to have already filled it out so that all you need to do is get it on the calendar,
Yeah.
because it's going to be so when your nipples look like raw hamburger meat, that's not the time. It's just too hard. You're going to be in such a vulnerable state then. It's going to be hard to get over the hump of making it happen.
Mhm. Yeah, and the other benefit of meeting with a professional prenatally is there are certain medical conditions that can impact how much milk you are going to make. And if I can get to these moms who have hypothyroidism, history of breast surgery, prenatally, we can come up with a plan to make sure baby is gaining well, to maximize the amount of milk that they can make. If I can start some of these things prenatally, they're much more successful than starting them, week 1, week 2, week 3 at postpartum, when the baby's already lost more than 10% weight loss and everybody's upset and emotionally.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And you can also kind of ground yourself a little bit prenatally to know, okay, we're going to do the best we can, and we'll have a plan. And any amount of breast milk is amazing, because every teaspoon provides 3 million antibodies, and I can still bond with my baby, and it's not an all or nothing endeavor.
Right.
So even if there is some impediment to full breastfeeding because of a medical condition, it doesn't mean that you can't still feed your baby your milk, even if there needs to be an adjustment to the plan.
Yeah, it's not all or nothing.
Whether you were in the prenatal period and would like to become educated about your feeding options and set yourself up for success so that you aren't playing milk supply catch up in those first few weeks, or you've already had your baby and you are feeling desperate for some answers you don't seem to be finding in your local community or in online support groups, I would love to be the person who provides some grounding for you and helps you feel more at ease about feeding your baby. In many cases, I can bill your insurance company, and if not, I can provide a super bill that allows you to submit for reimbursement. We can meet virtually or in person. Reach out to me at low@quabbinbirthservices.com. Can't wait to meet you.
So, my second daughter nursed until she was over 2. At that point, I had gotten pregnant again. So she self-weaned again during pregnancy. Unfortunately, we ended up losing that baby halfway through the pregnancy. And it took us another 6 months to get pregnant again. So I had been non-lactating for a while, for a few months when I got pregnant with my son, my last baby. I had him at home as well. He was also a big baby, over 9 pounds. Latched right away. It didn't hurt. It felt okay. And then like day 2, the pain just became ferocious. And at the time, I had very little support from family and friends. And unfortunately, my husband at the time, so his father, the father of my children, and I had separated. So I was essentially, at home, just giving birth with 2 toddlers and this baby, and no help. No one was there. And if I thought my second was painful, it was nothing compared to what he did to my nipples. And again, at the time I had started the process to become a Leche League leader. So I knew more about breastfeeding, and I knew of an IBCLC. So I did call her. I did ask her to come and take a look. She did look at the latch. She said it looked fine. He was getting enough milk because I had massive oversupply. So it was just spraying in his mouth. Now, looking back, I know now that he has a tongue tie. He's been in speech therapy for like 5 years. He can't eat a lot of foods. And it wasn't that this IBCLC didn't tell me or didn't catch it. It's just, and my son is 12 years ago. No one was talking about tongue ties or learning about tongue ties. It just was not a thing. So she did not know that he had a tongue tie. And of course I didn't either. And it was really bad. It was extremely painful, to the point where I was trying to numb my nipples with ice cubes before I latched him on out of desperation, which do not recommend doing that, FYI, if you're listening to this. But I was so desperate. And my nipples were just so torn apart. And I got the worst case mastitis that my midwife had ever seen. And to the point where I was so feverish that I was texting my midwife and I was not making any sense. So she came right over to my house, like emergency, came over to my house and found me kind of like almost passed out on the couch with like
Mm.
this really high fever. And she wanted me to go to the hospital to get IV antibiotics. And stubborn person that I was, I called the local hospital. I said, if I come in to get these antibiotics, can I bring my baby with me? And they said no. And I said, then I'm not coming in, because I did not want to be separated from my baby. I later, when my son was closer to a year old, was visiting that midwife and apologized to her for ignoring her recommendation to go into the hospital, because I really should have. But I was not thinking straight and did not want to be separated from my baby.
Who would have been with your children?
I suppose I would have called in the process of becoming my ex-husband at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I did, we did call him after my midwife found me, and he did come down and hold I wouldn't necessarily say it was helpful, but it did help a little bit, and stayed the night to make sure I was okay. And my midwife, I remember we had reached a compromise. We called my doctor, which I already talked about, when she was like, well, maybe it's MRSA. And we ruled out that it was MRSA because she found out I had a home birth. She called on antibiotics, and my midwife said, I want you to take two doses of the antibiotic. And if your fever doesn't go down, I'm calling an ambulance on you and you're going to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the deal that we made. And luckily, after 2 doses, my fever broke or started to go down. So I didn't end up in the hospital. But it was bad. And for a while, I was exclusively pumping that side because it was just so painful to watch him on. Even with a nipple shield. I remember trying a nipple shield, and it was still whatever. So for 48 hours, I breastfed him on one side. That was still painful, but not as painful, and pumped the other side. And that's how I got through it. And then eventually, again, it stopped hurting. But because my oversupply was even more dramatic with him, he didn't really even have to suckle or anything. He just hung on for the ride. And
Mm-hmm.
and he was a tough baby. All the things that we now know tongue ties can cause happened with him. He had horrible reflux. He was up every morning from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. just screaming, and nothing I did could help him. And I'd sit on the bed, and he'd wake up my second, and she'd come sit on the bed, and all 3 of us would just sit on the bed and cry.
Mm.
And I don't know how I didn't get postpartum depression, but I did.
Wow.
But yeah, it was not good. And then eventually, the pain went away. My nipples healed up. He did have, again, something that's caused by tongue tie. Eventually your supply down regulates. And if your baby's got a tongue tie and they're just hanging on for the ride and they're riding that letdown, and then that letdown starts to get a little less. So his weight gain had kind of slowed, and he did start to drop off his curves when he was older. But at that point, he was old enough for solid foods. So I just started to give him a little bit more solid foods. But he ended up breastfeeding until he was 3. So he was the longest breastfeeding journey.
Wow. Did
Mostly
the pain ever dissipate for you?
It did. But I think it took a good 6 weeks
Mm-hmm.
for the pain to go away fully.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, it was just the issues of him coughing and choking at every feeding, more so than my other 2 children, because not only was the flow strong, but he couldn't manage it because he couldn't lift his tongue to form the milk into a bolus. And that's what gave him the colic and the reflux. So he was my hardest baby by far, which, he's my sweetest kid now. So he definitely this kid does not have a mean bone in his body. He does not. He's my sweetheart. So, but it was really, really hard. But, and at that point I had gotten better about calling for help. Like I said, I did have someone come by, but again, we didn't know about tongue ties back then. And so I never got it released, and he's still dealing with that today at 12 years old. But I breastfed him until he was 3, and he remembers, asking for nanas. I remember when he was about 6, I was trying on, I think I was at Old Navy, and I was trying on dresses. And so I brought him into the changing room with me, and I was taking my shirt off to try on the dress. And he goes, "Mom, you still have nanas?" And I was like, "Yeah, they don't go away. They're attached to me." And he's like, "Oh," and he's very looking very serious. This is a very serious conversation for him.
Uh-huh.
And he's like, do they still have milk in them? And I was like, nope,
Mm.
no more milk. And he's like, I drank it all. I was like, yes, you did. And he was like so proud of himself that he like drank all the milk. It was just like, it was like one of the cutest memories I have of him. So
That's amazing.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
but I did it. I breastfed until he was 3. But he was my hardest one by far. I don't know. Like I said, if I had him first, I don't know if I would have had more kids, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because he was such a hard baby. But.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about it's surprising that you did not have postpartum depression because there were so many circumstantial things going on, becoming a single mom right around that time, the incredibly difficult breastfeeding experience, having the 2 older children who also needed care and attention, the severe mastitis. But it just goes to show that postpartum depression definitely can happen as a result of circumstantial things, but we also know that it is hormonal.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what was key for me with my first is, and I think a lot of people experience, when you're in it, you don't know sometimes
Right.
that you're in it. I did
Right.
not know, I did not think that I had postpartum depression. I thought it was just, I thought it was something just wrong with me at my core character, if that makes sense.
Yes.
But I remember thinking, for her first 6, I keep saying she, but my child's pronouns are actually they. But for my child's first 6 months of their life, I remember thinking, when is their real mom going to show up? Because they must, the real mom must know what to do. And looking back, that was like a red flag that I wasn't really connecting with my child. I was taking care of my child. She was very well taken care of. But I would take care of her. Like I'd feed them, change their diaper, and that was it. Like, so what was key for me was someone I was close to saying, I think you need to get some help. I don't think how you're feeling is quote unquote normal. And I was like, really? So what I tell parents now when I'm working with them, especially prenatally, is, if your partner or your mom or whoever comes to you and says, I think we need to talk about how you're feeling, don't dismiss them or be offended, because maybe they're seeing something that you're not. Because the person who talked to me was definitely seeing something that I was not, because I was in it.
It's so hard to know because you've never become a parent before. Or if you have become a parent, you've never become a parent of 2, or you've never become a parent of 3. And so it just feels like this is your new normal.
Yeah. I thought that's how everybody feels, right? Everybody feels like that. So that was the reason why it took me almost a year. I suffered with the depression for almost a year before I finally got help.
Yeah, it's a long time to suffer. Yeah. And so, Shelly, you mentioned that you were already on your way to becoming a La Leche League leader before you had your third. So the bug hit you.
Yes.
You realized that you wanted to help others. When you were becoming a La Leche League leader, did you know that that was going to lead you towards IBCLC, or did you just think, I want to try this and see what it's like?
I think I knew at that point when I started that eventually I wanted to become an IBCLC. So I started with the Leche League leader, then I became a CLC. That allowed me to get a job at a local hospital, and I got my hours there and through the Leche League for my IBCLC. So I've been running my private practice for almost 8 years now. And that's all I do. I also do like gentle sleep coaching and stuff like that too. But my primary practice is lactation support, and I love it. And
Yeah.
everybody's always like, wow, you must really love breastfeeding. And I mean, I do, right? I do. I'm obviously breastfeeding supportive, but that's not why I'm doing this. I'm
Hmm.
doing this not because I love breastfeeding and not even because I love babies. It's because it's for the parents. Because
Yeah,
I
that's
never
what I
want
say too.
another parent to feel the way that I did,
Hmm.
so isolated and so alone and in so
Hmm.
much pain, and thinking that it's something that that's a flaw within me.
Yep. I feel like people come to this field. There's probably other reasons, but for one or two reasons, either because they had this euphoric, orgasmic baby feeding experience. And like, they want everybody to have that. Or they come to this field because through suffering and they don't want other people to suffer. And they see the holes in the system and they want to reduce those systemic barriers. And that's why I came to the field. And I feel like those are my people and those are the people that I connect with. You were the lactation consultant who I called when I had my second baby, a home birth. You came, was it 3 or 4 times? I can't
He came
remember.
3 times.
You had an impact on me, just your calm manner of working with us and the way I felt just fully supported by you. I felt very supported by my first lactation consultant too. But I had so much trauma with feeding my first. I needed this to work with my second. I needed to be healed
Mm-hmm.
feeding Jolie. It had to work. I mean, I think I would have had a million babies if just to feed one
Mm-hmm.
in a way that worked. So luckily it worked on the second because I don't think my husband would have let me have a third just to feed her from my body.
Like, I'm gonna make
Um,
this work somehow.
I know, or I'd have been feeding somebody else's. Yeah. So, in addition to your private practice, do you also support people online, like all over the place,
Mhm.
or you mostly see people in person?
Yeah, I do virtual as well.
Hmm.
So I do in-person and virtual feeding, and that's breast or bottle. I work with a lot
Hmm.
of formula feeding families as well.
Hmm.
And then I do virtual sleep education appointments. Um, I also have a podcast, the Baby Pro podcast.
Hmm.
Um, and I have a parenting membership called the Baby Pro Bistro for
Oh.
pregnant families and first year of baby's life, where you can get, supportive community, all your prenatal classes, breastfeeding, newborn care, childbirth class, and then postpartum workshops too, like starting solids. And I do have a choosing the right formula for your baby, because not all the parents who join are planning on breastfeeding, and that's okay, because you should feed
Hmm.
your baby the way you want to. Things like that, and that's been fun.
That's amazing. Why would a person who is going to feed formula to their baby, why would they want to reach out to an IBCLC for support?
So the families that come see me who are formula feeding usually come see me because their baby is struggling with taking a bottle,
Hmm.
and they have not been able to find anyone else to help them.
Hmm.
And usually it's like a friend or family that's like, you should go see this person. And then they're like, what? I'm not breastfeeding. Is she going to judge me? Is she, you know what I mean? Um,
Hmm.
but if you've got a baby that's really struggling with feedings or taking a bottle, if you're spending, I worked with a family recently that was spending all day just trying to get food in their baby. And
Oh,
baby just
that's so
screams
stressful.
every time they try to feed the baby just screams. And they manage to get food in the baby's gaining. So what does the pediatrician say? Everything's fine. Baby's gaining well.
Right,
But they're holding their screaming baby and trying to feed it all day. Like, that's all they do.
right, right.
That's not
And
that's not a
that,
way to live.
right. And that's stressful for the baby. It can create oral aversions
Yeah.
for the baby. It's stressful for the parents. This moment that you envision of bonding with your baby. Everybody thinks, oh, I'm going to bond with my baby when I feed, whether it's at the breast or with a bottle.
Mm-hmm.
And when that becomes this moment of high stress, high intensity, it just deflates you.
Yeah.
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 So I do.
And when a baby has like, let's say that family tried feeding from their body and the baby was not able to transfer milk, usually that's an indication of something happening in the mouth that's making it difficult for them to transfer milk. So yes, you might change the feeding mechanism and it might be a little easier from the bottle, but it doesn't mean that whatever was making it hard for them to transfer milk at the body, typically at a breast, goes away.
Yeah, the issues are still there. And
Right.
this is the thing that like blows my mind about our medical system in its current state. You know, the ability to suckle and transfer milk from a breast is almost like another vital sign, right?
Mhm.
If your baby cannot latch and feed well, that is an indication that something is going on, that something is wrong, something's up. If you took your 3-year-old to the pediatrician and said, my baby can't, my child can't walk yet, they wouldn't say, oh, that's okay, we have wheelchairs, right?
Mhm.
That's a sign that something's wrong and they're going to investigate that. But if you take your baby to the pediatrician and say, my baby cannot breastfeed, they say, well, that's okay, we have formula.
Right.
And again, nothing wrong with formula. We want the baby fed. We want the baby happy. But there's no curiosity. There's no motivation to find out the root cause of the issue, why. And the problem with that is that can cause issues throughout the entire life. Like my son, he was gaining. So everyone was like, you're doing great. Well, now he can only eat like 5 foods and he's been in speech therapy for like 5 years. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not just about the feeding. If there's something going on where the baby can't do what they are biologically designed to do, that should at least throw up a red flag.
Mhm.
But it doesn't.
You
Yeah,
don't.
and I will say if you're working with a provider in IBCLC who is making you feel like crap about your feeding plan or imposing their own biases and beliefs of what feeding should look like onto you and your family, run.
Mhm. Run. Yep.
Run.
Both
Find a
Shelly and I
different
can help
provider.
you. Yep. Both Shelly and I can help you. We will help you. We will help you feed your baby in the way that works best for you, whether that's fully formula feeding, whether that is some combination,
Yeah.
or whether that is trying to increase your supply, whatever it is that you need to protect your own mental health and your
Mm-hmm.
supply, or figuring out a plan that works for you. If a provider is making you feel like crap, trust that and find somebody
Yeah.
else.
If
Yeah.
one of their first questions to you isn't, what are your feeding goals? Red flag.
Mm-hmm.
If you tell
Yeah.
me I want a combo feed, great. I only want to breastfeed until the milk comes in, great. Let me help you with that.
Mm-hmm.
I only want to breastfeed for the first 3 weeks, great. Let me help you with that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you say, I want a combo feed, and they're like, well, you shouldn't do that because this, and this, run.
Right. You're the one who has to feed that baby. It's your life.
Yep.
Right. Awesome, Shelly. Well, I so appreciate you going down memory lane and telling us your personal stories. Was there anything else that you wanted to add that you didn't get to talk about when it comes to your own personal?
Oh, I think I covered it all.
Okay, great.
And if any of your listeners are on Instagram, they can follow me on Instagram too, Shelly Taft IBCLC. I do Q&As in my stories like once or twice a week.
Yeah. Your Instagram is great and your reels are amazing. They're really fun. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come
Thanks
share
for
your
having me
stories.
on. It was fun.
As always, I will have all the ways you can contact Shelly in the show notes. She keeps it real all over social media, but Instagram is her jam. She also co-hosts an amazing podcast called the Baby Pro Podcast, which has all sorts of tips about all things baby, not just lactation. I will link an episode to her show where I talked about my experience as a disabled parent. And of course, I would love to see you join my Milk Making Minutes community group, where we discuss all the ways that systemic and cultural barriers make baby feeding difficult. And Because my family celebrates both Hanukkah and Christmas, I'm going to do a little Hanukkah celebration over there to celebrate both the holidays and the fact that I am finally an IBCLC. So join my Milk Making Minutes community group, and you'll see the details there where you can win a virtual lactation consultation for yourself or a family member. So join the group and you'll get all the details there. Bye.